Hello and welcome to another episode of The Future Of. I'm your host, Azam Faruqi. Unfortunately, my co-host Vasi is unavailable today. However, we have an awesome guest with us today, Ahsan Butt. Hi, Ahsan. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No, our pleasure. So, for those of you who may not know Ahsan is an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He's also an author of the book Secession and Security, explaining state strategy against separatists. His work has appeared in journals such as International Organization, Journal of Global Security Studies, Journal of Strategic Studies, Politics and Religion, and Security Studies. So we're very happy to have you today with us, Ahsan. And what we really wanted to talk a little bit about is last month in March, was the 28th anniversary of the Iraq War. And a lot was written during this time. There are a lot of op-eds written about some people who may have changed their tune on the war over this period of time. Some of them doubled down on their premise that they were right, like Bret Stephens wrote about it in New York Times. It's a little bit of a different topic for us, from what we usually do on our podcast. But the reason I want to talk about it is when all of this took place, I was in university, and a lot of times monumental events like these tend to have, it can create a moral and political worldview for yourself, obviously when you go through these things. And I'm trying to remember the conversation I had in universities back then, because, taking political science, you're in the middle of a lot of these conversations in classes and things. And I think it was probably a little bit different being in Canada, because Canada chose not to go to war. So I think the conversation in universities must have been different. But I realize you were probably around in university at the same time as well. So why don't you talk a little bit about your experience at that time?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I came to the US as a university student in January of 2003, which is obviously right in the middle of the run up to the war. I went to a small liberal arts college in Ohio called Ohio Wesleyan University. Most of the students were sort of, as students are wont to be, were sort of anti-war, but they weren't. I wouldn't say it was sort of an overwhelming majority, and certainly it did not comport with my understandings of student populations. When I had read about the Vietnam War, for instance, and the protests on university campuses against the Vietnam War, I did not personally witness that type of sort of, backlash against the war. But certainly I would say the median student was probably against the war. But that said, yeah, I certainly recall some very prominent pro-war voices in the classroom. I recall like just a sense of bewilderment and bafflement at how certain claims of the government were being taken for granted by people who should be questioning or would be questioning government claims in different contexts. And so it was quite a strange experience, honestly, coming to the US at that time. There was the reality of what I was seeing day to day on well, I didn't have a television at that time, but certainly I could read newspapers online at the time. And the distinction between what I was reading every day in sort of newspaper columnists, by newspaper columnists and so on, and op-ed columns and so on, versus what I had been, the sort of hunky-dory version of America, where like there's a quote-unquote marketplace of ideas, and it's a democracy, and the government is treated with skepticism, and there's a free press, and the free press challenges the government, and so all of these sort of government 101, democratic theory 101 sort of ideas of what a democracy is supposed to be like and what a liberal democracy is supposed to be like. I saw a very stark distinction between what I was told a liberal democracy looks like and what was actually happening. And so that sort of that time, obviously, I think for you and for me, I think I think we were roughly the same age, did have a very, very big impact on my evolution as a young adult and as someone with views on politics and an ideology and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was also reading Shadi Hamid, who's part of Brookings Institution, he writes a lot for Atlantic and for his own website as well. And he wrote this article, and I really enjoyed it. And I think he meant something along the lines of, in times, sometimes bipartisanship can be ruinous. And I think it was one of those moments, right? So even as a university student, I felt, sometimes you kind of find yourself in a weird spot because you're really trying to understand the world at that time. I came in right after 9/11. I moved to Canada here, and just the conversations and discussions, and when it ramped up to Iraq War, I just found myself in very different positions. So I just wanted to get your take on it. But the reason we have you on the show, last month you shared a paper that you wrote a few years ago about why the U.S. Invaded Iraq in 2003. There was an op-ed for Al Jazeera as well. So let's start with that. You said that the causes had little to do with fear of weapons of mass destruction, obviously, which we've learned now, or other goals such as desire to spread democracy. Rather, the Bush administration invaded Iraq for its demonstration effect. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. The basic argument I made in the paper is that the US invaded Iraq for, as you said, the demonstration effect, which is in essence to send a message to the rest of the world that it was a tough state, that it was an aggressive state, that it was not a state to be messed with, and that its hegemony would be unchallenged going into the future. So the idea basically here is that, the idea is basically a status or reputation centered argument, right? That after 9/11, the US feels very humiliated. It feels sort of shocked that someone could, that any group, let alone, a major state like China or Russia, just a terrorist group could take it on its own soil. And so it feels this need to sort of respond in an aggressive way. And obviously it goes into Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is a very, very minor and very weak power. And so, reducing Afghanistan to a rubble is not really showing the might of America or the strength of America in a way that satisfies the administration. And this is something that they themselves are saying, like, the day of 9/11 and the week after 9/11, not like 18 months later. They're saying it right after 9/11 happens, that Rumsfeld literally says, we need to bomb something else other than Afghanistan to show that we're big and strong and we're not going to be, thrown around by these types of attacks. So there's a sense that the US has to show how strong it is, to show how tough it is. And so it has to pick a target, and Iraq fit the bill for historical reasons. And so the argument is essentially that the US invaded Iraq to send a message to its rivals, everyone from North Korea to Iran to Syria, as well as friends in many senses, that it was not going anywhere, that it would remain king of the hill, that it would remain the hegemon of the system. And so there wasn't really a dyadic dispute per se, such as WMD. WMD formed a larger context for the war, but it certainly wasn't a cause for the war, in my opinion. As well as other purported goals, such as spreading democracy or the oil lobby or the Israel lobby, I don't think really explain why the Bush administration chose to invade Iraq and chose to invade it when it did. Whereas I think the demonstration effect argument has much more going for it. And so this argument sort of should be familiar to people, who watch television shows, who watch movies with, like, a prison gang or a drug cartel or a prison bully, where the idea is that you beat up on someone, not necessarily because you want what that person has or there's something at dispute with that particular person, but you're trying to send a message to everybody watching, right? That you're trying to show everybody else watching how big and strong and tough you are. And so beating up on this other actor is a communicative act. And so that's why I use this term performative war, because you're sort of performing. The war is for the benefit. It's a performance for everybody else. It's a performance for the audience. And so that's why I use that term.
Okay. So then the question inevitably is, did the US succeed?
Well, obviously, no, it did not. No, well, obviously, it did not. no, I feel that both the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars showed the limits of American power rather than showing American strength. Ironically, if the US had stayed in Afghanistan and not gotten distracted with the Iraq issue, arguably they would have done much more to deal with the jihadist threat than they actually did. And they would have done much more to show American strength if they were successful in, quote unquote, I wouldn't go so far as, quote unquote, saying remaking Afghan society, but certainly reorienting the politics of Afghanistan in a more sort of Western friendly direction. That alone would have been a major accomplishment and would have shown American strength in a way that ironically they could not foresee. So, but this is a very sort of, this mentality that you show strength by fighting and winning is not restricted to international relations. Like I said, everything from prison bullies to drug cartels to the state, the origins of the state. When we think about this, the very origins of the state as a coercive enterprise and as a set of bureaucratic institutions, it comes about by defeating alternate reservoirs of power. And so it sounds nice to say you would show strength by sort of governance, but generally leaders think of everyone from Machiavelli onwards, and even going further back from Machiavelli, thinks of demonstrating strength through war, through fighting. And so, but no, to answer your question, of course not. The Iraq war was a debacle. The Afghan war was a slow-moving disaster. And both showed the limits of American power much more than the extent of it, I think.
Okay, so the reason I ask, because it's an obvious answer, but the reason I'm asking is, okay, so the outcome wasn't what the U.S. intended. Obviously, you can probably credit the rise of ISIS, with the vacuum that was created in Iraq. It's debatable if Iraq is better off today. I mean, that's up to the Iraqis maybe, but looking at it. But if in hindsight, do you think if the outcome would have turned out a little bit differently, if the political system may have been a little bit more robust, was there any way this could have succeeded for US? Let's say if Abu Ghraib wouldn't have happened. Let's say if,
is there any way the Iraq war would have succeeded?
Yes.
I mean, it depends on what your counterfact. Like, what are we incorporating into this counterfactual? Has 9/11 happened? Has is everything the same? And the only thing is different. Like, what is the one thing that's changing? Like, that's the way I would pose the question, because there were, I guess, a different way of phrasing that is that there were a lot of causes for American failure in Iraq. And so you'd have to be specific about, what factor is changing. Is it, European support? Are France and Germany on board? Is it Arab support? Are the big Arab countries on board in a way that they were in Afghanistan, for instance? Is this,
let's say if there was more broad consensus, let's say if the UN would have, supported it, or.
But that again is, I hate to overcomplicate what I think you're trying to ask a simple question, and I keep sort of overcomplicating a simple question. But even that just throws the can down the road, right? Because why will the world have a consensus on this? Because the argument they were making was a WMD argument. And so the world was basically saying, the major countries like France and Germany and Russia were saying, okay, let the inspections process play out then. And so then I would sort of volley your question back at you, is like, has the inspections process thrown up something different, or has it been allowed to, have the inspectors not been allowed to come in? I can see in that case, more of a case where France and Germany say, okay, well, so, you have to be super specific what's changing. And, like I said, a different way of saying this is that there were a lot of causes of American failure in Iraq.
For sure. And the reason I'm trying to push is because I just want to run some counterfactual. So I don't want to change the variable of Afghanistan, because I think that drastically alters everything, because you're not diverting resources, and so Afghanistan, let's say, stays as is.
Okay.
But let's say the argument is not about WMD. The argument let's say if it truly is, let's say Saddam is evil and we need to take him out for the betterment of Iraqis, whether it's his treatment of the Kurdish or other minorities, could a better coalition have come together? And in that case, one, would you justify the ground invasion? And two, could the outcome have been different?
So again, you're going to hate me, but I'm going to complicate your question again, because like if the argument is human rights and Saddam is terrible and a genocidal maniac and he's murdered hundreds of thousands of people, and what about the Kurds and all this stuff? Forget a foreign coalition. That doesn't get you a domestic coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Like the US, like Americans supported that war roughly 60 to 70%, depending on which poll and when you look at the poll. But in the run up to the war, roughly 60 to 70% of Americans supported that war. But they supported that war because they were made to feel afraid, because they were told this guy is involved in 9/11 and this guy has weapons of mass destruction that, as Condoleezza Rice said, we don't want the smoking gun to be the mushroom cloud. And so that's why 60 to 70% people support that war. If you go to the American public and say, you know what, the reason 18 months after 9/11, the reason we have to take out Saddam is because he's a bad guy, that doesn't get you even the domestic coalition, because Americans are not generally predisposed to invading other countries because they're led by bad people or bad things are happening there.
Mm-hmm.
In the political culture, there is, I wouldn't say isolationist bent for a country that's this interventionist. It wouldn't be fair to say that they have an isolationist bent, but there's certainly a great deal of, there is a strong group within the American body politic historically that is very skeptical of the rest of the world, and certainly very skeptical, extremely skeptical of humanitarian interventions. This is a country that had nothing to do with Rwanda. There's genocide happening in Rwanda. Look the other way. This is a country that took at least a couple of years to get moving on Yugoslavia, and that itself was a NATO issue and could be done through NATO because of the European connection in a way that Iraq could not. So this, in Somalia, 18 troops die and, the Americans come home like that. And so this is not a country predisposed to humanitarian interventions. And so, again, I hate to overcomplicate your question, but my answer to your question of what happens, everything stays the same, but they go in with a humanitarian argument, is my argument is that that war doesn't happen then, because they don't even get the American public behind them, let alone an international coalition.
And so thank you for that, because one of the things I found very interesting over the years, and even, follow, obviously Twitter is not the entire universe, but it's a good subset to look at people. And in some shape or form, yes, a lot of people have changed their views over Iraq over these past 20 years. But I find there still hasn't been the kind of reckoning as a country that they've had, let's say, post-Vietnam. Like, there's still this tension there that going to Iraq was justifiable. And the reason it occurred to me is because when Russia invaded Ukraine, Noah Smith, who has a Substack, and he wrote this thing about the darkness of the Iraq War that still hovers over US foreign policy. And the responses to a lot of them, which are just a lot of normal people, and you find that, people using polls, and I don't know how scientific you can get into polls when, in a country like Iraq, and still justifying and still feeling that, I find there's still not enough like there still hasn't been any reconciliation with the fact that this was an unjustified war.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's sort of a strong version of that, and then even the weaker version of that still doesn't go as far as I would like. So, like, the strong version of that, as you say, I think you named dropped Bret Stephens earlier. You can throw people like David Frum into that equation as well. And a lot of people sympathetic to the Bush administration, that this was not a bad idea. This was a good idea executed badly, right? And a lot of that comes down to, the intelligence, wasn't black or white. It was shades of gray, and different people could have read it differently. And, I just think that that's a lot of self-serving, nonsense, frankly. The intelligence was being politicized and the intelligence was being pushed into a certain direction. So the idea that they're just passively receiving, these shades of gray intelligence, they themselves are injecting, elements of black paint or white paint into shades of gray intelligence. And so, that's a totally fanciful argument, especially given, I think the smoking gun for that argument is that 4 months of inspections reveal nothing in the run-up to that war, right? It's not like they're just receiving intelligence and they decide to go to war. It's that they're receiving intelligence. The inspectors go into Iraq for 4 months, investigate more than 500 sites, more than 700 times, come up with nothing, ask the CIA, what do you know? The CIA tells them, okay, here's 36 sites. Remember, they're going through 500. CIA gives them less than 50. They go through those sites. They say, there's nothing. Do you have anything else for us? They ask the British intelligence, do you have anything else for us? They get blown off. And so this argument, they're like, oh, the intelligence could have been read either way. It's kind of difficult for me to believe. So I think that's sort of one version of the argument that, it wasn't a bad idea. It was a good idea executed badly. So I think that doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all to me. Then there's sort of a weaker version of this argument, which is, okay, we concede it's a bad idea, but they're sort of wrong about why it was a bad idea, right? So this is a group of people that says, yes, America was overstretched. Yes, America did a bad thing by invading. We shouldn't have invaded. It was wrong. But the reason they say it was wrong is there's always a sort of, again, going back to the sort of limits of American power, that we should have been more aware of what our limits are. We should have been more aware of sort of, how difficult it is to remake other societies, right? And so it's almost like this sort of it's not a sense of guilt or a sense of shame. It's a sense of, miscalculation of resources. Like, if only we were stronger, or if we didn't recognize how weak we were, if we didn't recognize how resistant the rest of the world would be, then, things could have turned out different. But I still think even that doesn't go far enough, because even that is saying, that's a strength argument. It's not a moral or ethical or political argument about sort of like that the motives for this war were like not great. Like they were synonymous with a bully. They were synonymous with a hegemonic bully. And so I don't think it goes far enough to say, we should have been more cognizant of the limits to American power. I think the real proper the word you use is reckoning. The real proper reckoning deals with why this war was fought, right? And what were the goals and motives of both the American public as well as the American body politic. And I think when that question is properly addressed, that's when you actually have a real reckoning. But I don't think that's actually happened.
No, because a lot of times it seems like whatever sentiment that shifted, when news of Abu Ghraib torture, the prison came out with all the atrocities that occurred, it almost seemed like that was kind of forced in a way that, yes, it came out, so we look bad, but if it hadn't come out, maybe the sentiment for the pro-war would still have been stronger.
In the US or outside?
In the US.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's either or. I mean, it's both and, right? I mean, I think even without Abu Ghraib, the declining public support for war is sort of overdetermined, in the sense that just the fact that there was no WMD and just the fact of the insurgency kicking off and just the fact of the American body count rising, even though it wasn't a huge body count, but it was enough to get, attention in the US. And, the violence after the invasion, the war was sold in the US as we're going to be greeted as liberators and they're going to be throwing flowers on us when we go in. And not just people in government, like so-called liberal, like Tom Friedman wrote a column saying, I suspect that when American troops roll in, they'll be, they will have flowers thrown on them. It's like, so, people were thinking this. And so very clearly, very, very, very quickly, when you see a very clear and radical departure from what you were promised. So the point is that the war was going badly. And so with or without torture, with or without revelations of torture, I think you would have seen a declining public support for that war. Of course, the torture didn't help for a certain segment of the population. Other segments of the population might be happy or even proud that that's happening, frankly. Yeah, we should give it to them. That is a real, frankly, a real sentiment for people here. But yes, it is the case that more people were probably disgusted by it than felt pride in it. But I don't think that was. I could be wrong. To be honest, I want to preface this that I haven't studied public opinion that well during the war. So what I'm saying to you is mostly impressionistic and sort of going by memory. My scholarly focus was sort of on the run up to the war, but my response on sort of the public support for war is certainly just going by memory. But if you go by memory, I think if you look at the polls, they were declining anyway, even before. So the torture stuff comes out, I believe, in 2004, the summer of 2004. But by then the war is already sort of 18 months old, I want to say. And so by then, the public support was already declining, I want to say.
Okay. So going back to your paper, one of the things you wrote that there's not been a lot of studies done into the cause of the war. Now, since your paper has come out, has that changed? And if not, why do you think there hasn't been enough? Again, do we go back to this country not having this reckoning, or what's the reason it hasn't been studied as much?
I can only speak for my field, international relations and security studies. I think the reasons for it not so I wrote this paper. The paper was published in 2019, and I started writing the paper in roughly 2015, 2016, just to give you and your listeners a sense of the timeline. So when I say, there hasn't been investigations into the causes of the war, you should take that as me saying that in 2015 or 2016. So at that time, I would say the reasons for there not being a great deal of investigation into the why of the war, I think, is slightly different than what we were talking about earlier about the reckoning in the broader American public. And that we'll have to go a little bit inside baseball for that. If you and your listeners are interested, I'm happy to do that.
Absolutely. Anything baseball, I'm interested.
So in the mid 1990s, there was a very famous paper written by James Farron, who's now at Stanford University, about the causes for war in general. The paper was called the Rationalist Explanations for War. And one of the basic insights of that paper was to consider, although it wasn't a super original insight in the sense that, this follows from a Clausewitzian sense of war as politics by other means. And there's been other IR scholars such as Jeffrey Blaney who've talked about this. But essentially conceiving of war as a bargaining process, right? Or war rather as a failure of a bargaining process, that war only happens when two or more parties are unable to find a negotiated settlement on an issue. Now, that might sound horribly trite and obvious to you, and it is in a sense, right? But the question then becomes, why would a peaceful bargain not be able to be found by two or more rational actors, right? So the paper was called Rationalist Explanations for War. And he goes into sort of these three explanations that even perfectly rational actors can go into war for three reasons: a commitment problem, an information problem, and issue indivisibility, right? And so these are three reasons that two perfectly rational states may not be able to reach a bargain on anything they're disagreeing on, whether it's a nuclear weapon issue, whether it's a territory issue, whether it's a who gets to rule our third, our buffer state issue, whatever the case is. Two or more states can't find a negotiated bargain for these three reasons. This paper basically structured, I'm not overstating the case. This paper basically structured all of security studies for the next, basically to this day, right? And considering the war as a bargain, a war is a failure of bargaining. And especially this idea of commitment problems and information problems, right? Commitment problems basically speak to when two or more parties reach a solution, but they don't trust that the other party will stick by it, right? And because of a lack of trust of sticking to that agreement, you fight, because why wait for the balance of power to change against you, when if the balance of power is relatively favorable today, you want to fight today rather than wait for tomorrow, if you don't trust, right? And then information problems are a separate issue. I won't get into that right now. But so this commitment problem, becomes a very, very big talking point in international relations scholarship. And it basically becomes a big cause of war in everything from interstate war. I use the commitment problem in my first book and my dissertation on separatist war. I'm basically saying separatist war is a result of a commitment problem. So I myself use the same bargaining tool, right? Same bargaining sort of framework in my work, right? Now, the reason, now to go full circle to try and answer your question of why did international relations scholars not investigate this war to the extent that I think it deserved? The reason is, I think the official explanation, namely that WMD, that Saddam has WMD, and we can't trust when he says he doesn't have WMD, and we don't know what he has, we don't know what he doesn't have, and so we want to strike today in case, as Condi Rice said, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. The WMD explanation was so consistent with IR scholars' prior beliefs about why wars happen, that wars happen because of potential shifts in the balance of power and an inability to commit to bargains struck before those balances shift, right? So in this view, Saddam's possible acquisition or Saddam's possible holding of or stocks of WMDs represents a shift in the balance of power. And given the shift in the balance of power, the US and the rest of the West can't trust any bargain struck with Saddam. Because that story fits so well with pre-existing notions of why wars happen, there was sort of a sympathetic understanding of Bush administration motives, even when, if you ask IR scholars on a one-on-one basis, do you believe them when they're saying this? They would say no. But the theoretical story made sense. And so that's basically my view of why IR as a field didn't really address non-official explanations for the war over and above certain fringe, I wouldn't call them fringe, but over and above certain arguments that weren't super well received, such as the Israel lobby, which Meir Shaman wrote in 2006, that was largely disputed, at least as a cause of the Iraq war. It's not the case that IR scholars dispute the existence or the strength of the Israel lobby. It's that they dispute the Israel lobby as a cause of the Iraq war. And so, other than the Israel lobby, the oil explanation never really got a lot of time either for IR scholars. The two big ones, as I said, were WMD, because it comported with IR scholars' frameworks, and democracy, which also comported with a different set of IR frameworks about liberalism and liberal ideology and the perils of sort of liberal imperialism. And so these two pre-existing frameworks of war as a bargaining process, or war as a failure of the bargaining process, and war as a result of sort of this neoconservative idea of spreading democracy, because those two official explanations comported with IR models, they weren't questioned as much as they possibly could have.
Okay. Moving on from that, if we talk about lessons learned from this, I don't know how often states do actually learn lessons, but in light of the Arab Spring, especially with somewhat intervention in Libya or lack thereof in Syria, how did the decision to go to Iraq play a role in all of that? What do you think?
In the Arab Spring?
Mm-hmm. Or I would say non-intervention in Syria or intervention in Libya.
It's tough to say. For sure, it has resulted in more of a reluctance to use overwhelming military strength. I don't think it's, as I said, because there hasn't been a real reckoning, it hasn't fundamentally reshaped American interventionism, as you said. Sort of, the US was involved in led the Libya effort, and while it stayed away from Syria in terms of a full-on ground invasion, that the US was and remains involved in Syria. Maybe not to the extent that opponents of the Obama administration circa 2014 would have wanted, but it's not nothing. But yeah, of course, there's been a greater reluctance, I think, to go back to those two arguments, right? So one argument is it was, we we could have read the intelligence. Anyone could have read the intelligence differently or the same way, right? So I think that leaving that argument aside, but the second argument of, the limits to American power and we were wrong to invade. At least that argument, that argument has found a home in both important segments of the public as well as important institutions in both the Republican and Democratic parties today. Maybe not DC writ large, maybe not the quote unquote beltway, but certainly important elements of both parties. So there is certainly a reluctance to wage war, or full blown war. As for the Arab Spring, it's tough to say. As I say, it's not my area of study, so I do it. It's an impressionistic understanding. I'm not a scholar of the Arab Spring. Certainly, you can draw a connection between what happens in Iraq and what happens in Syria. I think that's a reasonable claim to make. The rest of the Arab world, I don't know. I mean, I think most people who study the Arab Spring would probably say a lot of domestic factors are really important. Maybe the Iraq War played a role in perhaps shifting the incentive structures or shifting the preference structures of authoritarian elites from Mubarak in Egypt to Assad in Syria. But honestly, it's tough to say. I don't want to make too strong a claim on that topic because it's not something I study. So, but I suppose it did have some effect, I suppose.
And how about on the domestic front? How do you think that played a role? So can you make an argument that Obama probably, would have been where he ended up being if it weren't for the Iraq War, his opposition, bringing troops back, and subsequently even, it's a bit of a loose connection, but even the rise of Trump?
Yeah, so let's talk about Obama first. I think that's a very clear case. If you go back to the 2008 primaries, the primary distinction between Obama and Hillary was in foreign policy, and that Hillary Clinton had supported that war and voted for that war. And Obama spoke out against that war, not in hindsight, which is when a lot of American political elites, including Hillary Clinton, spoke against it. But luckily for Obama, he spoke up against that war while it was in the run up to it and while it was happening. And so by the time that the 2008 primaries rolled around, which are really fought in many ways in 2006 and 2007, as much as 2008, right when sort of the anti-war movement is really gathering a pace in the US. I don't think there's any doubt that certainly the timing of Obama's ascendance to the presidency, perhaps you can run a counterfactual. Obama becomes president anyway, given how talented he was as a politician and given sort of where America was. It's perhaps the case. I don't want to, it's conjecture, but it's perhaps the case that Obama would have become president anyway, but maybe not in 2008, right? That was very early for him, right? He was a very young man at that time, reasonably young man at that time. He had not even completed, I think he had, as soon as he got elected to the Illinois, as a senator in Illinois, he basically started running for president. So he hadn't even completed a term as senator. And I think he had one term as state senator in Illinois. So he was relatively inexperienced. And so certainly the fast pace, the rapidity with which he became a political superstar, I think has a lot to do with the Iraq War. Maybe not everything, other factors as well, sort of, but I think the Iraq War had a lot to do with it. Trump, tougher to say. I think probably tangentially, indirectly. I think the 2008 recession, I mean, if you want to say the Iraq War has something to do with the 2008-09 recession, then yes, then I'm willing to make that claim. But I'd have to talk to an economist to see how much of a connection there is between the Iraq War and that recession. Certainly the war wasn't paid for. Bush invades Iraq and lowers taxes, which is sort of the opposite of what you're supposed to do historically. Wars generally cause raises in tax rates, with America lower tax rates. So possibly there might be something going on there. But I would draw a stronger direct line from the recession, from the 08-09 recession, as well as Obama's election himself. Let's not forget. I mean, this stuff is all dynamic, right? The fact that a black president is elected in 2008 and then again re-elected in 2012, does something to the brain of roughly 25 to 30% of Americans. Like, it just fundamentally breaks them in a way that, so I think Obama, I think the biggest factor, more than the Iraq war, the biggest factor in many ways, I think, for Trump, more than the Iraq war, was the election of Obama himself.
Mm-hmm.
So indirectly, you can
Obama making fun of him at the dinner, right?
Well, that's why he chooses to run, but why people choose to vote for him. Sort of this racial backlash idea, this idea of changing America, and we want our America back. What could be more emblematic and symbolic of a quote-unquote changing America than a black president? So, especially for a certain segment of the Republican Party and conservative voters. So, if you want to draw an indirect connection, I think that's a stronger claim. The Iraq war causes Obama, which in turn causes Trump. The Iraq war causes a recession, which in turn causes Trump. I think that claim you can make, but I don't think you can make a direct causal connection between the Iraq war and Trump, per se.
Okay. And the reason I was thinking is you talk a little bit about, you go to war. A lot of times now, Republicans, they're going more non-interventionist, right? So I always wonder, did the war have something to do with it? You wasted resources. Like Trump, some of the arguments he always made is we've been paying our allies, especially he's been going after those NATO allies, right? Paying for security and everything. And, even general comments about, there's this funny speech he once made, right? About, and I don't remember exactly, but when he says that, well, okay, we're going to go liberate them. But then the women say, we've been doing this. We've been wearing our hijab or niqabs for 1,000 years. It's like, why the hell are we getting involved in that for? Right? So there has been this non-interventionist in some shape. I mean, at the end of the day, he ended up going and they did kill, and I'm forgetting. Yes, exactly. So again, that's why sometimes you wonder if that non-interventionist, at least the narrative with the populace, had something to do with the war.
Yes and no. I certainly think that the war has, of course, as I said earlier, of course, the war has changed Americans' perceptions of the advisability of going to war, for sure, on both sides. I think that's true, and certainly there's more of I think there's different camps, right? Your sort of neocon camps are generally pretty unapologetic, but there's other camps within the Republican Party, sort of that I wouldn't use the term isolationist, but certainly we can call it a more skeptical camp. That has found a greater voice in the aftermath of the Iraq War. So I think that's certainly true. I would dispute the idea that Trump himself was a non-interventionist. I think Trump was a nationalist, but I don't think he was an isolationist. So I would dispute that characterization. I don't think he was a non-interventionist per se, although a lot of his rhetoric sometimes signals to that. Other parts of his rhetoric signal otherwise, and some of his policies, as from assassinating Soleimani to escalations in Syria and Afghanistan, whatever the case may be. And the other part, I would sort of, all it takes is sort of for these same people. It's like I said, it hasn't been a fundamental shift. It hasn't been a fundamental intellectual political shift, because it would just take one trigger or one, I don't even want to say, forget 9/11 style attack. It would take one event outside America, one Chinese balloon, one, for them to, so I think it's a very superficial non-intervention. I agree. Let me put it this way. I agree with you that there has been, for some segments of the population, there has been a chastening, and there has been a greater reluctance to pursue forceful foreign policy. But I think it's a very superficial trepidation, and the the intensity of the trigger that it would require to overwhelm that is very low. Like, I don't think it would take much for them to be like, no, we need to do this, we need to do that. These are, because this goes back to what, I'm a scholar of nationalism. This is still an intentionally nationalistic, if we're talking about the Republican Party, this is an intentionally nationalistic party. And in general, the US is a nationalistic country. And so the terms of engagement with the rest of the world might have temporarily changed in response to strategic or tactical setbacks, but the fundamental worldviews haven't changed. And so that would be my sort of response to that question.
Okay. So before we wrap this up, I just want to ask you one question. So one of the things, obviously, we established, and you wrote in the paper, is Afghanistan was not a strong enough state for them to show the power, right? Just tying it back. So it had to be Iraq. Could it have been any other country?
Probably yes, realistically no. My whole argument, as I said, is, it's a demonstration effect. And so you're trying to convince those other rivals, Iran or North Korea or Syria, the other potential targets. So the way to convince them is to take on Iraq. Could you have gone Iran first or North Korea first or Syria first? I don't think so, because again, the intellectual history here really matters. If you go back to the 90s, the same neocons who lead the sort of the run up to the war in 01, 02, 03, these are the same folks who in the 1990s were basically creating this intellectual policy position in the Beltway. Even though the government was opposed to it, even though there was a Bill Clinton administration that was saying, what the hell are you guys talking about? But there was this sort of the neocon position, whether you're talking about think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, or whether we're talking about, most importantly, publications, such as the Weekly Standard with Irving Kristol, whether we're talking on the Hill, that there was this sort of camp that had Saddam and Iraq in their sights, that basically were almost offended by the idea that when the US went to war against Saddam in 1991, that they didn't also do regime change, that the goals of the mission or the goals of that war were for this camp very limited. Just get Saddam out of Kuwait. And once he's out of Kuwait, the war is over. As far as George H.W. Bush was concerned, and his sort of very realist administration, your Brent Scowcrofts and your Colin Powell of the world. But the neocons viewed that war as a failure. The neocons viewed that war as, we are the strongest country in the world. This is the country that challenged our order and our ally, and we only sent him back to his border. We should have cut his head off, metaphorically, if not literally. So there was this whole sort of intellectual thrust in the mid and late 90s for attacking Saddam. And that meant that when this 9/11 shock happens and this need to demonstrate, like if my argument is right and the US needed to fight any country to show its strength and to show that it was not going to be messed with, Iraq was the primary target. It may be not the only target, but the first target, right? The first obvious target, because they had Saddam and Iraq in their sights even before 9/11, when these guys come to power. If you read documents from the summer of 2001, Donald Rumsfeld is talking about, well, wouldn't it be nice if Saddam was replaced in Iraq? Like, that would show what American power is all about. He's saying this in July, 2 months before 9/11. So conceivably, the answer to your question is yes, in the sense that the logic would apply equivalently to Syria or North Korea or to Iran. But given the intellectual and policy conversations in the 1990s, realistically, no, Iraq was the best and primary target.
Okay. So one of the themes for our podcast is we always talk about the implications for future, right? Or what does the future look like? So for an event like this, what are some of the lessons for states, do you think? Or in general, do you think states do end up learning any lessons from wars? Or
look, I think I divided sort of the sort of global I divide into sort of the global reaction and the sort of domestic reaction. And even the global reaction, I divide into different camps. I think if you look at big, powerful states like China and Russia, the lesson they learned was anything goes. And, there's now a precedent for this type of stuff, right? So it's not a coincidence that, the Iraq war happens, I think, like 18 months into Putin's tenure as Russian leader. And so I think if you're in Putin's head, you're like, well, okay, I guess big powerful countries can do whatever the hell they want. And so not to say that Putin's actions are as a direct consequence of the Iraq war, but I think they certainly show that, they certainly are a precedent for big powerful countries doing whatever they want to minor powers. And if tomorrow China invades Taiwan, which I'm not saying they will, but that's the same argument. Like, how can the U.S. look at China? How can the U.S. say, Russia, don't invade Ukraine, China, don't invade Taiwan, after having invaded Iraq, right? So like that doesn't make, there's like no argument there. So I think that's one. I think the global reaction for sort of for sort of allied countries to the U.S., your sort of Western Europes of the world, your Middle Eastern allies and so on, Latin American allies, was obviously a good deal of declining trust in American strength and power. A lot of that was regained under Obama. Obama tried a lot to sort of solidify those alliances, especially the NATO alliances and your Northeast Asia alliances. But that sort of skepticism of American motives, and we saw this very directly in Darfur, for instance. One of the reasons Darfur has such a quiet, Darfur happens 2 years after Iraq, and one of the reasons it has such a muted response from the West is a lot of Western countries don't want to use a humanitarian logic to do anything in Darfur, because they think, the Germanys and Frances of the world think, if we use a humanitarian argument for Darfur, that gives credibility to the American humanitarian argument for Iraq, which we don't want to do. So certainly, I think globally, the lesson learned was, America's motives can often be deeply questionable. Domestically, I think we've sort of covered this ground, so I wouldn't belabor it. I think some lessons have been learned, but not necessarily the right lessons. So I would just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ahsan, this was very insightful, very fascinating. So thank you very much for your time. Before we let our guests go, for levity, we do ask one question. Is there a book, a TV show, and a movie that you would recommend our listeners? We've actually compiled a pretty good library of list of books that we've recommended or our guests have recommended on the show. So why don't you add to that?
A book, a TV show, and a movie. Mm-hmm. Is this from recently or
anything?
From
anything that you would recommend?
Okay. It'll be tough off the top of my head, but yeah, a good fiction, a good novel, I would recommend. I guess your podcast listeners like war and so on. A good war novel is Chimamanda Adichie's book on the Nigerian Biafran Civil War. I think it's called Half of a Yellow Sun. It's a very good novel. If you like war novels, I would read that, Half of a Yellow Sun. A good television show, I guess Secession would be the obvious one. It's the best show on TV right now. But historically, I would say The Wire and Sopranos would obviously be great television shows as well. Mm-hmm. Good films. There's way too many good films. There's way too many good films. There's too many good books as well. I don't know. Let's go with Parasite, I guess. Parasite's a good film. Yeah. That director's he has at least two other movies I would also recommend from that same director. So yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, those are the ones I'd go with.
Yeah, it's surprisingly, it's one of the tougher questions. People take a lot of time to think about it.
Because there's so many, right? You don't know what to choose. I mean, there's just so many. I'm lucky enough to read a novel almost every week or 10 days. So I don't know what I would recommend. But I hope your listeners like Half of a Yellow Sun. It's a good book.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Ahsan, and we hope to have you back in the future as well.
Thanks for having me. It was a lovely conversation. Thanks.
Take care.